Welcome to the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. I'm Allie Rose, certified clinical hypnotherapist and subconscious success coach. I help my clients stop self-sabotage and feel safe to create more wealth, worth, and wellness from within. If you find yourself stuck repeating the same unhelpful patterns in your life, health, business, or relationships, even after all the mindset work, this podcast is for you. Each week, you'll hear deep dives into the hidden beliefs shaping your life and live hypno-coaching sessions where someone shifts a block in real time. Because willpower isn't the problem, your subconscious story is. And when you shift it at the root, everything else begins to change. So let's dive in. Hello. Welcome back to the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. We are so excited to be back with you today, where we will be talking all about the subconscious roots of perfectionism. So, as always, Safiya, before we dive in, how are you and how are you feeling about this topic today?
I'm great. Perfectionism, such an interesting topic. Definitely ready to dive into this. Can't wait.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you a personal question.
Hmm.
Is it something that you feel like you struggle with at all?
You know, yes and no. I never really identified as a perfectionist because I genuinely don't believe in perfection, and I never felt like I was aiming for perfection. But I definitely have high standards that some may call perfectionistic that I sometimes will hold myself to at times when I won't hold others to those standards. And while I wouldn't call it perfectionism, because I'm not somebody, I don't think I'm detail oriented enough to make anything perfect.
Right.
I very much have standards that some may call unreasonable. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. I would say that I am definitely a recovering perfectionist. It's something that I have to be mindful of. And it's something that I've done my own work on, my own hypnotherapy sessions on. So, yeah, maybe we'll dive into that in a little bit. But I want to just clarify that for me, it's not really just about like someone who likes things neat and organized or done really well. When I'm talking about perfectionism, I feel like it's so much deeper than that. It's really a survival strategy. It's something
Mm.
that we learned as kids to get our needs met and feel safe. So, potentially, somewhere along the way, we got the message that if I get it right, if I keep everyone happy, if I never mess up, then I'll be okay. And so that shows up in these perfectionistic tendencies. And the problem with that is that perfectionism often hides behind what looks like strength or ambition. And
Mm.
so a lot of times it can go unchecked or unnoticed because people might see you as driven or dependable or high achieving. But inside, there's usually a lot of fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of letting someone down. So it's not just about having high standards, right? It's about believing that your worth and safety depend on staying flawless, right? So it's a story. It's not because a lot of people will say, like, that's just who I am. And I agree. Some people have some natural tendencies, maybe, or a bent toward that. But oftentimes it is a story that you've been living out of, often without realizing it.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. I'm looking forward to diving more into it. I think I'll get my thoughts around it more as we talk about it, as always.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously we've defined it, and we like to do that when we start. And I know you said that underlying perfectionistic behaviors is usually sort of a safety strategy of feeling like your worth or something depends on you not messing up. And I think sometimes even when I talk about high standards, I think sometimes people can't see that they're perfectionistic because there is no such thing as perfect, right? So they think, oh well, since I didn't do this thing perfectly, then clearly I'm not a perfectionist. So given that it's a safety strategy,
Mhm.
What are some of those early childhood experiences or sort of like family rules that can start people thinking down that road of their worth being tied into the outcomes?
It often starts way earlier than most people realize. I think it's in those tiny everyday moments that seem so small at the time, but they leave a lasting imprint. And so I was thinking of some of the people that I've worked with around perfectionism, which often it's not where we start. Often someone comes in with something else, and then we recognize that perfectionism is actually tied to something bigger. But for example, maybe you brought home a report card and the room lit up when you had straight A's, but fell quiet when you didn't. Or maybe you cried and you were told, don't be dramatic or that you need to be strong. Or that when you behaved a certain way, the home felt calmer. And when you didn't, there was tension. So kids are little detectives. They're constantly scanning the environment and picking up on these unspoken rules like what earns connection, what leads to conflict, what keeps the family safe and stable, right? And
Mm.
the other side of things, which I found really interesting, and here's where I'm going to maybe dive into a little bit of my own personal, is that sometimes perfectionism comes from chaos. It's a child trying to create order when things feel unpredictable. And honestly, I think that that's where my perfectionism, which I have been, working on, came from. There were periods of our childhood that were very unstable and chaotic. And I think that perfectionism became my way of coping. Honestly, before we popped on, I was thinking about this topic, obviously, and I was thinking about the way that I used to clean my room. Like, I used to, whenever I was 12 years old, sixth grade, I remember. I mean, I would rearrange my room monthly. I would pull all of my furniture out of my room. I would vacuum the whole room, put the furniture back in a different way. I would either the books would be, like, color coded 1 month, but then they'd be alphabetical order another month. There was a lot of I mean, I look back and it was, like, borderline becoming maybe a little problematic in some ways, the way
Mm.
that it was, but I look back on it now and I do really think that I was trying to create order in the space that was my own and in the space that I had control over, if that makes any sense.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny that you say that because as soon as you said that, I was like, so it's knowing, it's kind of feeling like there's some things that are out of your control.
Yes.
This is the thing that's in my control. And playing it out there. So when you first described it and you talked about the positive and the negative reinforcement, like, yes, if you bring home a great grade, you know, people will light up. So it's not just the like people being angry at you if you do poorly, but also the praise that you get when you do well. But then what you described almost felt more like a control thing. Like this is what I can control. There's chaos out there. I can't impact that. I can't create that positive reinforcement from those outside people, so I'm gonna create it in myself in this thing that I can control. So they're a little bit different. Do you feel like based on how it started, it shows up differently? Or have you noticed that with your clients?
That's a really good question. I think that it can probably shapeshift. I think that it can shift and change because I'm using myself as an example here because this is something
Mm,
I've struggled with, right? And so I was a straight A student. I was the vice president of my junior class, senior
mm,
class. I was the captain of the cheering squad. I very much also had that side of things where I was driven by that. But I look at that in the same way as that also was control in that in some ways it was me getting to control the image of who I am, who I was. as in the same way that my room was an area that I could control. And also, if we're going deep here, I feel like I'm having a therapy session with myself, but it's like I've shared that, I was one of 2 Black kids growing up in my town. And so I think perfectionism allowed me to be pleasing, allowed me to control the narrative about who I was as a person. If I was seen in the positive light of straight A's, captain of this, I worked at the local grocery store, like all of the things, then that kept me safe from
Mm.
being otherized, right?
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because one of the things I was thinking about is that some people are naturally held to higher standards than others, right? And there's a part of me that almost feels like it can make it difficult to spot and address perfectionistic behavior if I I know depending on where you live, because obviously I grew up in Barbados where it's a largely Black population, but coming to the UK and obviously in the States, it's like a Black person may be held to a higher standard, I should say, than someone who is not. So then it almost can be very difficult to almost spot that and deal with it, spot that perfectionistic behavior and deal with it because you also have that societal reinforcement that you feel like you can't even let it go.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, there's this thing where Black women often pursue more degrees, more education, feeling this feeling of being held to a higher standard than maybe someone else might be, right? Because you have to prove yourself. And and yet there's also this high levels of stress and high levels of burnout, right?
And then I think it's and I guess we'll come in a minute to, like, what someone can do if this perfectionistic tendency is leading to, because we talked about burnout a few episodes ago, but, like, if the perfectionistic tendency is leading to stress, increased stress, burnout, we may talk a bit about that. But I think it's just worth acknowledging that for some people, you know, they may feel it's harder to let go because there is such pressure on them to maintain a high standard.
Right, and I don't wanna just say that it is Black women, but I will say a lot of maybe minority populations or people who are immigrants who have come here, obviously, there's higher standards in some regard and different cultural background, upbringing that causes them to fall into those perfectionistic tendencies of overworking themselves based on cultural conditioning or, family conditioning, right?
How does that get passed on in terms of family relationships and those unspoken rules?
Yeah, I think that our parents and our grandparents, they grew up in their own set of challenges, right? Maybe there was poverty or discrimination or trauma. And so oftentimes, and again, this makes me think of, maybe I'm stereotyping, but I think stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason sometimes. In immigrant families where there were certain things that they've had to overcome, challenges they've had to overcome, and they learn to survive by overperforming or holding themselves to impossibly high standards, right? So even if they never said it outright, that message gets passed down. You have to be twice as good to be taken seriously, right? And for women, there's another layer, which is being expected to keep emotional balance in the family. A lot of women become the ones who fix and smooth things over and keep everyone happy. And I think more and more this is being talked about, and I think more and more women are kind of bucking against that. But it's not necessarily something that gets told to you, but it can shape how you see yourself, right? Being perfect becomes less about choice and more about duty, right? Duty to the family norms. And of course, it's not about blaming anyone, right? It's about understanding that what helped your family survive, that might just be hurting you now and giving yourself permission to choose a different way forward, right?
Yeah. I definitely agree with that.
Mm.
How does it usually show up? Because I know you said quite often with your clients, they'll come for something else and then eventually it will show up like it is perfectionism. How does it usually show up?
Well, like I said, it's a little bit sneaky in that it can be wrapped around a lot of different things. And because it's related to control, I'm thinking about one particular case in general, and it was tied a lot into image and relationship with food. And I think that that's another area in our lives where we can exert a lot of power and control when we feel like other areas of our life might be out of control, is with our relationship with food, or in terms of our image, a preoccupation with the way that we look, right? That kind of thing. That's another area where someone can really focus and control if, they're struggling with feeling out of control in another area of their life. And
Yeah.
so, again, it's the impossibly high standards that someone holds themselves to. And often what I find is that for people, there's a little bit of a rebellion when that happens. So it might look like needing to release perfectionistic tendencies so that your body can actually relax a little bit, because perfectionism wreaks havoc on our nervous systems. And
Mm,
so when we're wreaking havoc on our nervous systems, it's a lot harder for our body to release weight from our bodies, right?
mm,
Because if you think about it, perfectionism is like this controlling, holding on very tightly to
mhm.
something. And that can be the same way that the body will hold on very tightly to weight. And so I
Yeah.
find that they can be linked because there's a holding on that is impacting our nervous system, which doesn't allow the body to release weight.
Mm, okay.
That's just one way. It's just the first
Yeah.
one that came to my mind, but it can show up in these other ways, right?
Yeah. I'm curious because I know obviously quite a few weeks ago you were talking a lot about entrepreneurs and business sort of owners. Do you feel like it shows up in that entrepreneurial space as well?
Oh, 100%, because it's it's the mask of high achieving, right? So, but again, as you said, it does show up a lot as procrastination. I think that that's really where I see it in the entrepreneurial space, right? Because if you never start, if you never put yourself out there, you never have to risk failing. I see it in people pleasing, right? Keeping everyone happy. So you water down your message. You don't put yourself out there in the way that is going to attract your ideal client in any way, because you don't want anyone to be upset with you, right?
Y
Or it can show up as overhelping, constantly anticipating others' needs. And so you feel indispensable, but you also might be staying broke because you're overhelping and over delivering, and you're not charging enough for your work, or you're so burnt out that, your business doesn't feel sustainable. So 100%, it absolutely can show up for business owners.
One of the things you mentioned when you were talking about the example you gave earlier was the toll that it takes on the nervous system.
Mhm.
So I a bit curious about that. I'm curious about you gave the example in relation to the body and weight, but what are the toll that it tends to have on the nervous system, and how does that then impact people's life, their health? What impacts does it have?
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with you. I don't believe that perfect is a thing. I don't believe that anybody's perfect. I don't believe it's an actual thing. But perfectionism is more about the striving, the trying to be perfect, right? And it keeps your body in a constant state of alert, right? And so as a kid, making a mistake might have felt like danger because it threatened your connection with caregivers or others in your life. And so your body, there's the book, The Body Keeps a Score. So your body learns, if I get it wrong, I'm not safe. And
Mm,
that belief gets stored deep down, and even years later, your nervous system then responds to mistakes as if they're life-threatening, which is why something small, right, like actual helpful feedback or maybe a missed deadline can feel so overwhelming. Your body doesn't know the difference between a minor mistake and a major threat. So, obviously, living this way long term takes a toll. It shows up as anxiety, fatigue, sleep problems, physical illnesses, right? Because your
Mm.
system never fully gets to rest. And as you were saying, it also narrows your capacity for joy and creativity, right? And
Yeah.
so that's how it can show up for your nervous system. And so healing it really involves teaching your body that safety doesn't come from having complete control or by being perfect. It comes from self trust, connection to your inner wisdom, and knowing that you can easily repair whenever things go wrong, right?
Yeah. I think that's so important as well. The understanding that you can repair, because one of the things you talked about how it could show up in relationships and families and that type of thing, especially if you're someone who does feel like you have to hold everything together and keep things under control, and then you don't do that, then you can actually still repair those relationships.
Yeah.
What other impacts do you find perfectionistic tendencies have? Because obviously we talked about the nervous system and the impact on the body and how that person feels in terms of that anxiety and everything. But like, how does that then impact people's relationships, whether it's a professional relationship at work, whether it's a personal relationship, family, friends, that type of thing?
Perfectionism just feels heavy, right? Emotionally, perfectionism creates shame. No matter how much you achieve, it never feels like enough. There's always another goal, another standard to meet, right? And as I said, physically, living in constant stress, it just wears your body down. And then in relationships, perfectionism builds walls. When you are performing all the time, people don't get to see the real you. And the opposite, you might hold others to the same impossible standards that you hold yourself to, which can create resentment, right? If somebody's not meeting the same high standards that you hold for yourself, then that might create some resentment in your relationships, right? And
Mm,
then I would say, I think the deepest cost, though, is time. You cannot get time back. Time
mm.
spent proving instead of living and striving instead of connecting. It's like you get caught up in that cycle of wasting all of this time because if you need to do it a certain way or you have to do it over and over and over again, you waste a lot of time living in that space, right?
Yeah. When I think about it in creative context, because I know a lot of people who I feel like they do let that perfectionism stop them from doing those things, and they do waste that time, but also they never actually get to create the thing that they wanna create, right? That's just a lost opportunity, and it's funny that you talked about gaining self-trust, because I think sometimes being a perfectionist actually erodes your self-trust,
Right.
right? Because you feel like you can't trust yourself to do something properly, whatever it is. And if someone's hearing the conversation and thinking, "Oh, I never really thought about how perfectionism is showing up in my own life," because maybe they did just see it as high standards, or they did just feel like it wasn't optional. What are some steps that they can take?
Yeah. I mean, as I always say, the first step is awareness. So it's about, recognizing yourself in this conversation, right? And then maybe starting to look at where am I doing this to myself? Because as I said, it can show up in a lot of different areas of your life. And then obviously, real change doesn't come from simply telling yourself to stop being a perfectionist, right? So to shift it at the root, you have to address where it began
Mm,
in that deep belief that perfection equals safety. And honestly, that starts with the body. If your nervous system has been on high alert for years, it needs to learn what calm actually feels like, or it needs to learn that it's okay if you make a mistake. Like noticing the hypervigilance that you might go into whenever you make a mistake. I think you can go back to those early moments, just thinking back to maybe where they took root. You can reflect on them, revisit those experiences, and really bring compassion to your younger self because your younger self created this as a way of coping with whatever felt unsafe or out of control in your life as a child. And helping that younger version of you understand that they were just coping, right? And then I think from there, once you have the awareness, once you've reflected, like, where do I think that this took root in my life? Why is this showing up in my life? Then you have to practice start living differently, right? Allowing things to just be good enough, letting
Mm.
yourself rest without the guilt, showing up as yourself, even if it feels vulnerable. And so instead of forcing it, right, I often tell clients, like, start really small around allowing something to be good enough. If it feels really terrifying to think of doing that in terms of your business or in terms of work, okay, then do it in relationship with your partner or do it in relationship with a friend or do it as you were talking about in creative pursuits where no one else is going to see the creative thing, but you just allow yourself to be a little bit messier with it. Let it be good enough, right? So it's the awareness, the reflection, and then it's the practical action steps where you start to allow yourself to show up differently. Then you start to show your nervous system. It's okay to just allow it to be good enough. It's okay to allow myself to rest rather than going back. And I'm thinking of whenever I said to you about going back and editing all the audios for the podcast. I wasn't going to do it, but because I am recovering from perfectionism, there was a part of me that wanted to go back once I learned more about audio editing, wanted to go back and edit some of the first episodes. And I
Like,
didn't do it.
no.
I didn't do it, right? But I noticed that there was a part of me that wanted to do it, and then
Mhm.
the thing is that I didn't do it, right? That's really where the power comes in to tell yourself, "Hey, Allie, it's okay that your first couple of episodes, maybe the audio wasn't as good as the last few, and that's okay. That's okay. They were still listenable, right?"
They 100% were. They 100% were. And I like that example because one of the things that happens when you actually decide to take imperfect action is that you get better. If you use podcast as an example, you were like, we're going to record these episodes and we're going to put them out there. And that to me is like a big step for somebody who's a perfectionist because you were like, you're going to do the thing regardless. And through doing that, you were able to improve the sound quality. So you could see that actually taking this imperfect action, I gained more skills, I gained more knowledge, things actually improved, it got better. And it wouldn't have got better if you just sat on it and did nothing, right? It was the act of doing it that improved it. But then to think this thought in the back of your mind that like, oh, maybe I'll go back now and like re-edit all the other ones. It's almost like a second way that it's sneaking in there then, isn't it?
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that because I've done a lot of work on being a perfectionist, I knew that I wasn't going to do it. I knew that I wasn't going to go back. However, obviously, because we have such a good relationship, I felt safe enough to say that to you. And your response was, I mean, you didn't do anything magical or mysterious, but your response was basically like, no, just let it, just let it be. And your response immediately helped that other part of me just relax, and you helped validate the part of me that knew that the right thing to do was to not go back and edit all of the other ones, right? And so I'm bringing that up because I think that sometimes it can be helpful if you're walking through this and you have perfectionistic tendencies to have a safe person in your life that you can just be like, hey, so here's what I'm thinking of doing or not doing. And that person can kind of gently, like, you weren't shaming of me, you weren't whatever. We kind of laughed about it together, right?
Mm.
But I think it can really help to have someone who can hold that space for you and, like, call out that perfectionistic tendency and also let you know, like, it's okay to not be perfect, right?
Absolutely, and I'm gonna shout out my sister because she does that for me, especially someone that you trust because I think that's always gonna be helpful. Now, one of the things I was thinking about when you first talked about this starting so early in childhood and that is that I feel like people get to really identify with being the the expert or the good girl or the straight A student. I think when you have that as an identity, letting go of it can have that positive effect in terms of letting your nervous system relax and everything, but also it can feel like you're losing a part of yourself, you know? So what would you like someone who feels like they don't want to let go that part of their identity? What would you like them to know about what is possible on the other side?
First, I just want to acknowledge and honor and validate that it can feel like an identity death. It can feel very terrifying. But I just want to say that it doesn't mean that you stop caring. It means that you actually get to start living. When I
Mm,
view perfectionism, in some ways, it's a cage. It's not somebody who's walking freely. It's somebody maybe who has like cinder blocks on their legs. They're walking very slowly, cautiously, carefully, having to scan for every moment, or they're constantly having to perform. So, again, I'm a very visual person. So I get an image of someone who is this perfectly polished person on the outside, and on the inside, there's someone who's waiting to be known on the inside. And it's exhausting. And it keeps you from ever feeling truly at home in your own skin, and so on the other side of that is freedom. It's like you're in the cage and the key is right around the corner, and all you have to do is reach out and grab the key and you can let yourself out. And then there's freedom, right? Freedom to rest without guilt, making decisions based on what you really want, not what other people want, to show up as your full messy self and know that you can be loved in that process. Someone that comes
mm,
to my mind, and I know that she's someone who really struggles with other areas potentially related to this. I don't know her personally, but Glennon Doyle. I think that in some ways her life when she was married and all of that, it was like a cage of trying to be someone that she wasn't. And she shows up messy and she shows up in all kinds of different ways. And people love that. People connect with the authenticity of who she is as a person. And so there is a freedom, right? So you don't
mm.
actually lose yourself, you lose this false identity, and you finally get to meet a version of you that's been there all along, who's worthy not because of what you do, but just because you exist. And that's the reality. We are all worthy simply because we exist. But if you never show anyone that, people are missing out on who you are as a person if you're constantly trying to be perfect. They can't actually get to know the real you, right?
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I definitely can see that. Ah, this has been a great conversation. It's like shaking up so many things in my mind. I like that. I like the idea of people getting to know the real you because I think you'll be surprised. People will like that. People will like you. You haven't given them a chance. So you have no idea. So yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, I didn't know I was going to air so much of my own dirty laundry on perfectionism and, like I said, being in recovery from perfectionism. But, I think that this is also an opportunity for me. Like, I don't need to show up perfectly on this podcast.
Mhm.
I can share the things that I have walked through in my own life that, have gotten me to this place of more messy authenticity, that have allowed me to take risks and just be more fully seen. And so I hope that in all of my ramblings about my life and in what we've shared today, that it has been helpful, and that, Sophia and I often say, like, if only just for one person to hear the message and take something away from it and feel like, you know what, I want to start to shift something in my life as well, then it's all worth it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm glad you feel free to share that story and hopefully somebody can hear it and hopefully they can start to release a bit of that perfectionism and show up as themselves.
So,
Great.
if after listening to our conversation today, you are recognizing that your deeply ingrained perfectionism is hurting you more than it's helping you, head to shiftyourstorypodcast.com. You can schedule a connection call, or you can just message me on Facebook or Instagram and we can chat about it. I'd love to connect with you, see how I could best support you, and help you finally break free and shift your story around perfectionism. All right. I think that's it for now. We're sending you so much love and gratitude. Until next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this episode of the Shift Your Story, Change Your Life podcast. If today's conversation sparked something in you, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to send me a message on social media. I'm at the Allie Rose on both Facebook and Instagram. And if you want to be coached on a future episode or explore what it would look like to work with me one-on-one, head over to shiftyourstorypodcast.com. And if you never want to miss an episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review. It helps more people find this work. Until next time, keep shifting, keep growing, and most importantly, I want you to remember that your story isn't set in stone. You always have the power to shift it.